Now we're going to be moving into the regional chapters of the book. So we were talking about generalities at first, and then we were talking about vertical systems. Now we're getting into regions. So as we get into the regions, you will find that there's overlap between the vertical systems and the regions because some of the vertical system information that we talked about before. So now things are starting to overlap, and hopefully we can kind of draw it all together in the end. So you will have a general idea of the nervous system as a whole, hopefully. So for the learning objectives, a few definitions and the four major nerve plexes and which part of the body they innervate. So the peripheral nervous system, you'll find it's a little simpler than the vertical systems that we have been talking about, even though it includes parts of the vertical systems. So really the peripheral nervous system includes all the neural structures distal to the spinal nerves and the axons of cranial nerves that are outside the skull. So a lot of our cranial nerves are inside the skull, but the ones outside the skull are considered part of the peripheral nervous system. So the axons of sensory, motor, and autonomic neurons, so those parts of the vertical system, along with their specialized sensory endings, and the entire postganglionic chain of the autonomic neurons form the peripheral nervous system. So examples of peripheral nerves that we've met before include the median nerve and the tibial nerves, the sciatic nerve. So the axons of cranial nerves are peripheral nerves, but they're the peripheral nervous system of the head, and so we talk about them separately. So all the nervous system structures enclosed by bone are considered parts of the central nervous system. So nerve roots, the dorsal root ganglia, the spinal nerves are within the spinal region, but distal to the spinal nerve, the groups of axons split into posterior and anterior rami. So the axons in the posterior rami innervate the paravertebral muscles, posterior parts of the vertebrae, and the overlying cutaneous areas. Axons in the anterior rami innervate the skeletal, muscular, and cutaneous areas of the limbs, and the anterior and lateral trunk. So spinal region lesions and peripheral lesions can be distinguished by the distribution of clinical signs. So that's one of the ways they're going to tell. Do you have a peripheral issue or do you have a spinal issue? So sensory, autonomic, and motor deficits in the spinal region show a myotomal or dermatomal distribution. Sensory, autonomic, and motor deficits in the peripheral lesion show a peripheral nerve distribution. So if you go back to chapter 10 and look at those body maps comparing dermatomal and peripheral nerve lesions, you can see that the signs show up in a slightly different pattern. So signs of peripheral neuron lesions include paresis or paralysis of muscles, sensory loss, abnormal sensations, muscle atrophy, and reduced or absent deep tendon reflexes. So peripheral nerve lesions produce those signs and symptoms in a peripheral nerve distribution. When we get to the spinal region, you'll see spinal region lesions produce signs and symptoms in a myotomal or dermatomal distribution. So hopefully that is starting to make sense to you. Peripheral nerves themselves are arranged in such a way that this is familiar throughout the body, very similar to the arrangement of muscle fibers and other structures in the body. So body takes success and it builds more success out of it. So peripheral nerves are parallel bundles of axons surrounded by three connective tissue sheaths: the endoneurium, the perineurium, and the epineurium. So endo inside, the endoneurium separates individual axons. The perineurium surrounds bundles of axons called fascicles, and the epineurium encloses the entire nerve trunk. So we've got these bundles of axons running in the white matter, because white matter is always axons. We also have a tissue sheath, a nerve tissue sheath that surrounds the epineurium. It's connective tissues, and there's tons of nociceptive nerve endings in those nerve sheaths. And so they can be a source of signals that can be interpreted as pain from nerve stretch and nerve compression. So that's something to think about when you're thinking about pain. Connective tissues of the neural sheaths protect the axons and the supporting cells, the glia, and they also support mechanical changes in length that nerves undergo during movement. So when we move, our nerves have to stretch and lengthen and shorten, and they're supposed to. And that lengthening and shortening, the tension in the nerves can provide nutrients and circulation, and that's important for nerve healing and just for general nerve health. So one of the things we're going to talk about is nerve tension positions and what positions put pressure on which nerves. It's kind of an interesting area and very relevant for the clinic. A lot of times you're working on an orthopedic injury and you're going to have someone do nerve glides to make sure that their nerves are moving in the tissue sheaths the way they're supposed to. So that's really super important. So peripheral nerves, they receive their blood supply from arterial branches that enter the nerve trunk. Within the nerves, the axons are electrically insulated from each other because we don't want crosstalk by the endoneurium and by the myelin sheath around each neuron. So the myelin sheath is provided by the Schwann cells, which partially surround a group of small diameter axons or completely envelop a section of a single large axon. So sometimes, a lot of times, the Schwann cell is servicing one single large axon, but sometimes it'll be covering several small ones. And the oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system, they encompass several different axons. So the small diameter axons that share Schwann cells are called unmyelinated, but those are the ones that are kind of partially myelinated. So those are like the C fibers that we've talked about before. They're smaller diameter, they're partially myelinated because they're sharing Schwann cells with other small neurons. And they are going to propagate the nerve signals more slowly than the larger ones that are fully myelinated. So somatic peripheral nerves are usually mixed, consisting of sensory, autonomic, and motor axons. So they either they innervate either the viscera or somatic structures. Cutaneous branches of the nerves supply the skin and the subcutaneous tissues, and muscular branches supply the muscles, tendons, and joints. So the median nerve, like when we talk about peripheral nerves, I'm giving the median nerve as an example, it innervates the somatic structures, the sensory, the autonomic, and the motor systems in the area that it serves in that peripheral nerve distribution. So it's mixed. So when you have damage to a nerve, you're going to have sensory, motor, and autonomic results. Hopefully that makes sense. So all the little different branches branch off to do their little thing. But muscular branches are not only motor because they also have somatosensory neurons to the muscles that help give that feed forward and feedback effect that you need for a motor act. So there's a lot going on in the peripheral nerves. So the nerves roots come out of the spine and they join together into the peripheral nerves. And the areas where the rami join together is called a plexus. It's called a nerve plexus. So the junctions of the anterior rami form the four major nerve plexes, which are the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, the lumbar plexus, and the sacral plexus. There are really detailed atlases in the book about the different plexes, and I'm not going to expect you to draw each individual plexus or anything like that, but just get an idea of what area of the spinal nerves branch off into the peripheral system and innervate the individual parts of the body, because that can give you clues as to what's going on with injuries as well. So the cervical plexus arises from the anterior rami of C1 to C4, and they lie deep to the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So the cervical plexus provides cutaneous sensory information from the posterior scalp to the clavicle and innervates the anterior neck muscles and the diaphragm. Super important. Diaphragm is innervated by the phrenic nerve, whose cell bodies are in the cervical spinal cord, C4 to C5. It's the most important single branch from the cervical plexus because the phrenic nerve is the only motor supply and the main sensory nerve for the diaphragm, which controls breathing. Super important. The brachial plexus is formed from the anterior rami of C5 to T1. The plexus emerges between the anterior and middle scalene muscles, passes deep to the clavicle, and enters the axilla. In the distal axilla, the axons form from the plexus become the radial, axillary, ulnar, median, and musculocutaneous nerves. MARMU, remember, is the acronym to remember those. The entire upper limb is innervated by branches of the brachial plexus. So we talked about this in kinesiology. This shouldn't be news to you, of the different plexes. But again, I'm not going to expect you to draw it. I just want you to know that the entire upper limb is innervated by the brachial plexus. So the lumbar plexus is formed by the anterior rami of L1 to L4. The plexus forms in the psoas major muscle. Interesting, right? And branches of the lumbar plexus innervate skin and muscles of the anterior and medial thigh. So if you have anterior thigh issues, it could be a lumbar plexus, could be an L4 femoral nerve. You can think about it anyway. There's a cutaneous branch from the plexus that's called the saphenous nerve that continues into the leg to innervate the medial leg and foot. But most of the lower leg and foot are innervated by the sacral plexus, which is the next plexus down the line. The branches of the cervical, brachial, and lumbar plexes provide sympathetic innervation via connections with the sympathetic chain. So they're all involved. The sacral plexus is located anterior to the piriformis muscle, and the plexus is formed by the anterior rami of S1 to S4. The sacral plexus innervates the posterior thigh and most of the lower leg and foot. So even though there's that saphenous branch of the lumbar plexus that innervates the medial side of the lower leg and foot, most of it is innervated by the sacral plexus. And the sacral plexus contains the parasympathetic axons as well. The relationship to the lumbar and sacral plexus to the vertebrae are shown in this diagram. So you can see kind of part of L4, L5, S1, S2, S3. So we think of them as separate things, but they are all involved with each other. So unlike the other plexes, the cervical, brachial, and lumbar plexes that contain sympathetic axons, the sacral plexus, in addition to the somatosensory and somatic motor axons, contains parasympathetic axons, so parasympathetic instead of sympathetic. So there are lots of good illustrations in the book. It's nice to, this is one of them. It's nice to look at them, but I don't expect you to memorize them. I just want you to know what areas of the body are innervated by each plexus. So movement is super important for nerve health. Movement optimizes the health of the nerves by promoting circulation, flow through the nerves, and the flow of the axoplasm through the axons. So just like anything in your body, we're basically a lot of fluid, and we need movement to keep the fluid moving. If you move, the axoplasm is thinner and it flows more easily. Just like the oil in your car. If you never drive the car and you just let it sit there, the oil just kind of gets gloopy. It's the same thing with your axoplasm. If you never move and you don't stretch your nerves, your axoplasm gets gloopy and it doesn't flow as well. That's my analogy for the day. So normally the fascicles glide within the nerve, and the nerve glides relative to other structures. So you need adequate blood flow to supply nutrition and oxygen and to remove the wastes of cellular metabolism from the neural tissues. So if the axoplasm is thick, it becomes more resistant to flow. So movement thins it and makes it flow more easily, and that facilitates retrograde and anterograde transport. So retrograde axoplasmic transport moves chemicals from the axons and surrounding structures to the cell body. When we're talking about these peripheral nerves, that could be a significant distance. So it's got to be able to flow, right? The the information that flows up in retrograde transport, besides recycling neurochemicals and that sort of thing, it also provides a lot of the information necessary to the soma to change production of ion channels, transmitted vesicles, and support structures. So the anterograde exoplasmic transport delivers the new structural and signaling components to the proper locations in the neuron. So the neurons are always adapting. They're always saying, oh gosh, we need more of these receptors. Oh, we need more of these receptors. So you have to have that flow back and forth in order for that communication to happen. So, we'll talk about the neuromuscular junction in a second. The connective tissues that are around the nerve support the changes in length that the nerves undergo during movements. So when you move, your nerves have to move too. They can't just be static. They actually get stretched. So when the nerve is stretched, the epineurium and endoneurium and perineurium stretch also, and the axons sort of unfold a little bit, and the fascicles glide relative to each other. As the stretching continues, the entire nerve slides relative to the surrounding structures. So if you've ever done nerve glides in therapy or in a yoga class or whatever, that's what's happening in the nerve glide. And there's some videos that I posted links to in the Canvas module that show different nerve tension positions. They're super important. The neurodynamic treatment after an orthopedic or any other kind of injury is really important for regaining function. So as the nerves are kind of folding and unfolding and coiling and recoiling, they need to be able to lengthen and shorten without injuring the axons or the supporting structures, right? So that's super important. The movement is very important in nerve health. So the neuromuscular junction we've talked about before. It's where the motor axons synapse with the muscle fibers. So nerve muscle synapses are always excitatory, remember. There's no summation of action potentials that's required to depolarize the postsynaptic membrane. All you need is um, just the motor axon to release acetylcholine, and boom, it's depolarized. So we never have inhibitory postsynaptic potentials at muscles. They're always excitatory or presynaptic potentials. In a normal motor unit, every depolarization of the motor axon releases sufficient acetylcholine to initiate the action potentials in the innervated muscle fibers, which is really nice. So there's no inhibition possible because the only branch of the axon, only one branch of the axon synapses with a muscle fiber. So we don't have multiple branches. So you're only getting that one excitatory signal. So every time you get an excitatory signal to a motor nerve, it creates a muscle contraction, which is awesome. So you want that to happen because you want that path that we talked about in the motor system, the motor tracts chapter. We want the path from the anterior frontal lobe to the spine, to the lower motor neuron, to the muscle, to be a clear path so you can initiate actions and have them happen. So without that neuron to muscle synapse at the neuromuscular junction, the muscles will atrophy. So if there's any interruption in the whole pathway, you're going to get muscle atrophy.